Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net, and you have joined us for the first part of a series we're doing on the individual collective works, if you like, that make up the structure of Judaism. And today we're talking about Torah. You can listen to an introduction to this series, which we kind of skim over the Torah, the Gemara, and the Mishnah by clicking the links on your screen now, or by looking for the link under this video. We're going to be guided through this huge library by Rabbi Joshua Neely again, who did such an amazing job in the last video. He's in Florida and he's feeling much better this week, which I'm glad to say. Thanks for giving us your time again this week. I'm really looking forward to going through this. So I think now we said that we were going to look at the Torah and kind of open it up and explain it for people that may have heard the term but mightn't be very familiar with it. But it's quite a difficult thing to do because, as we mentioned last time, Torah is a title which can mean so many different things. So before we start talking about it as a thing, when we're talking about it as a thing, what are we actually talking about? If we say Torah in this video, what do we mean?
All right, so when we're talking about Torah in this video, we are talking about the narrow set of the first 5 books of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. It is the T of Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And the Torah is the first 5 books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, if you want the Hebrew titles. That is the capital T, the Torah for this video. As you pointed out, we discussed the broader sense of the word Torah in our last video when talking about the big range of Jewish knowledge and Jewish understanding. But for this video, it is the narrow definition of Torah, meaning those first 5 books, what you will find written on the scroll in the sanctuary of every synagogue around the world.
Now, what we won't find written on the scroll is the other part of the Torah, which is the oral Torah, right? So,
and that is the traditional nomenclature, is that you have an oral Torah and you have a written Torah. And this is focused on the written Torah, which is defined as those 5 books. And we'll talk more about the oral Torah and its oralness when we go into depth on the idea of Mishnah.
So one other thing is Torah often is translated, especially in Christian circles, as law. And I think that sometimes puts, especially people that aren't familiar with oral Torah, they're often put off by the law title of the actual Torah, because if this is the law, how can we have an oral version of this concrete thing? But really, Torah it kind of means guidance, doesn't it? Instructions.
Instruction is probably the best generic term for it, yes. There are other Hebrew words that are more specifically law-like. Mishpat or chok. Mishpat in particular is a better word for law in and of itself. And of course, mitzvah is a commandment and what's the imperative sense. But Torah, it best comes from the word for instruction.
And so this is the first 5 books of anyone's Bible, and traditionally written by Moses.
So let's go ahead and jump right in there. So this is a topic which gets an awful lot of attention and isn't actually that interesting in and of itself. We'll go over it. Well, first we'll have to define how Judaism views Torah and why the Mosaic claim is somewhat intrinsic to this discussion, but how it was never overly emphasized after the fact. Once you accept the Torah as being authoritative, and that does come somewhat through the Mosaic lens, we don't talk about Moses on and on. We talk about the Torah itself. So in around the 1800s, beginning a little bit earlier with some scholarship in the Renaissance, the European academics began to discuss the notion that there were certain passages and sections in the Torah that seem to line up better with other sections and not with others. That is to say, it almost felt, they argued, that there were multiple authors, multiple source texts that had been woven together into one book, but really contain multiple voices. It would be the equivalent of having four different eyewitness accounts of an event, and then sitting down and taking a paragraph from here and a paragraph from there, and this guy added this detail, so we added it into this paragraph, and putting together one narrative of the event, but using direct cuts from the other four sources.
And this is called documentary hypothesis. Is this the...
Exactly.
Right.
It's called documentary hypothesis, or even more confusingly to people, biblical criticism, which doesn't mean criticizing the Bible in the way that I might criticize someone's essay. It means reading it critically, meaning with careful analysis and attention to the detail. Now, you might already have a few alarm bells going off, going, wait a minute, reading it very carefully with attention to detail, isn't that what Jews have been doing for the last 3,000 years? And the answer is yes. And in fact, there is nothing that was, in quote, discovered by the documentary hypothesis that wasn't already noticed by rabbinic scholars for the last 3,000 years. And Judaism internally, and maybe we should add at some point a whole discussion about midrash as a genre, had already spent a few thousand years coming up with explanations and learning from the incongruities that were being noticed by these academic scholars. So we had noticed already, the sages had noticed that sometimes there was one name for God and sometimes there were other names for God used. Sometimes there were two versions of the same law, which had minor differences between them. Sometimes there were interruptions in a narrative, that, or at least things that sounded like interruptions. You'd be having a nice, happy story, and then suddenly you get a list of names, and then the story picks up again. Sometimes you would almost seem to have two versions of the same story that were either back to back or side by side, or even attributed to different characters. And this was something that had already been noticed and handled both by Jewish law when it came to seeming incongruities of law, and it also had been handled by exposition, by midrash, when it was a question of, well, what does this mean when you see these differences or irregularities? So there was nothing new being discussed here. What was new, however, was the introduction of the idea that there were distinct authors, lowercase a, that each wrote completely of their own volition and their own will these texts that were then edited into the Torah that we now have by some other human author of his own will that wanted to harmonize them or put them together into one collection for some reason. That interpretation of the text was what was really new.
So okay, we're gonna say that traditionally Moses is responsible for 99.9% of the Torah, except for maybe the last part of the Torah after he's died, which is attributed to Joshua. But there is a group
Correct.
there are many people, especially in biblical historians, that are of the opinion that the Torah is a mashup of lots of historical texts that are rotating around a similar kernel of truth. Would that be fair?
Well, I mean, give or take your biblical scholar, they may or may not add the kernel of truth side. There are definitely what are often called minimalist biblical critics, which is to say they believe that the Torah is almost completely a mythical fabrication, that it never was written anywhere near to the time it was written, and what it describes is a complete mythology, rather than drawing from any kernel of truth whatsoever. And there's vogues in fashion within biblical scholarship, and so during some decades the biblical minimalists are in fashion, and during other decades the maximalists, the ones who believe that the Torah is basically true except for some human tinkering here and there. They go back and forth between who has control of which department at what university.
I get I mean, you can just if you read Genesis 1 and 2, you'll have two back-to-back versions of creation, which often comes up in atheist arguments. You know, how many creations were there?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, for me, it seems obvious that you're getting two accounts of the same thing. It's like, reading a preface and then an introduction.
Yes.
It's not, for me, it's not an issue, but I can see how it might be for people that are a bit more pedantic or that are looking for a problem. But isn't the Tanakh, especially after the Tanakh, isn't it full of references to the Book of Moses and the Law of Moses? I mean, even from Joshua, Joshua was teaching what Moses had taught. How could he have done that if the writings for what he was teaching hadn't even become an existent thing yet?
So yes and no. To be fair to biblical criticism. So the rest of the Tanakh doesn't give extensive quotes of the Torah itself. Now you have references to Moses, and you have references to the instructions of Moses, the book of Moses. But as far as having block quotes from the Torah to show that it was in front of the author of later books of the Bible, we don't have that. We have similar themes, but again, biblical critics just say, well, that just shows that the person who had that theme probably wrote that section of the Torah at that later date. So it's something that, as you say, if you are inclined to believe that the Torah was constructed at a later date, there is no evidence within the Torah or the Bible itself that can possibly dissuade you. It's not just a matter of lining up the facts in front of them and then the light bulb will go off and, now I understand. It is perfectly reasonable, lowercase r reasonable, to come to the conclusion they came to if it's the conclusion you really want to come to. And as you say, it is also perfectly reasonable, lowercase r, to come to the conclusion that these seeming incongruities and difficulties and redundancies all fit within a single authorship quite neatly and have explanations that are both insightful and meaningful rather than simply apologetics. And you sort of have to choose which path you want to walk. And that's been dominating the debate for about the last 100 years in many circles. And it's really a shame because the debate can actually be answered theologically with the wave of a hand. So here goes the wave of the hand, and then we can always just delete everything we just talked about for 10, 15 minutes. Although I'm going to make the case that the Mosaic authorship is important, especially within the traditional mindset, the ultimate authorship, that is to say, the capital A authorship, the entity, if you will, that caused the Torah to be written with the words that it contains, as opposed to fixating on who was holding the pen at the time that those letters were being put down, is the ultimate question. And someone could believe quite easily and quite faithfully that the Torah that we have, the letters on the parchment that we contain in our synagogue, were put there over the course of 500, 600 years by different authors at different times, and that were then edited together by one or two or three different levels of redaction, all under the inspired guidance of God. Saying, look, if God can move nations, if God can control the universe, surely God can coordinate the combined efforts of these human authors to make sure that the Torah that we ended up with is precisely the Torah that God wants us to have, down to every jot and tittle, or jot and tittle. That is not an atheist position. That is not a disrespectful position to God. It has some challenges with regards to the traditional view of Moses, absolutely. And that's why it can become a lively and spirited debate. But somebody who came to me and said, look, I believe the Torah was written over 500 years and by many different authors, but all of them were being guided, whether they knew it or not, by God, to make sure that the Torah that emerged from this process was precisely the Torah that was needed in each of their generations, as well as the final version that has come down to us. I would say that person still believes in Torah, that they are not discounting, they're not saying, look, this commandment, that was written by Bob, and that means I don't have to listen to it. Or this story, that was written by Tom, and that means I don't have to listen to it. They're not saying that. And there are many people who do have this opinion, that feel more comfortable with the accumulated version of the Torah rather than a single revelation act. And that's okay in my book. It's not my personal opinion, but I still definitely see that has a place within our faith community.
So we basically have to choose what we think is the right or the original authorship, but it doesn't really matter. It's the content's more important than the development or the
Correct. If you accept the text as divine, ultimately, who was the first guy who got to write it down becomes much less significant. And accepting it as divine is really the first step towards being a believing and then practicing Jew. And getting caught up on the authorship, lowercase a, of the person who took the dictation, the secretary, if you will, is missing the point of who the CEO was, of who actually dictated the letter that we're arguing over which secretary put it down. So yeah, it becomes a distraction often from that major question of who was the person who actually put it together, as opposed to who was the entity who put it together, as opposed to who was the person who put it down. All right, so let's then talk about why the tradition is not pleased with this idea, but that really comes back to an understanding of what the Torah itself is, right? So the Torah is the only part of the Bible that gives commandments. And yes, I know that sounds weird because you have prophets saying all sorts of things. We should go do this, and you should make peace with that king, and you should make war on that king, and you should give back this or whatever. I mean, the prophets are saying all sorts of things all the time and telling the people to do this and do that. But the prophets are speaking to their generation first and foremost. They do not make commandments for all time. And secondly, there is an understanding of what prophecy is that is, we need to unwrap what it means to have prophecy, at least a little bit. I don't think we can go into the entire field, but in Jewish tradition, in Jewish understanding, prophecy means that you have prepared yourself spiritually and mentally to be able to perceive the truth of God with as little interference from yourself as possible.
Doesn't prophet Navi, doesn't it literally mean like a spokesperson?
Correct. But the spokesperson model is not one of, or let me back that up. It is one that should be as passive as possible, but that passivity, that lessening of the self to allow only what God is trying to transmit through is the difficulty that most of us face. I mean, in life in general, let alone ever reaching the stage of prophet. It is not that God simply picks, Bob or Tom and says, "All right, Tom, nice to see you. I want you to go tell these people something." And then Tom goes, "Okay," and walks off and tells things. Prophecy is something that an individual has prepared for by their own spiritual and mental preparation. As actually I mentioned in my Understanding God YouTube, what was that, last August, I guess, the transmission from God is ongoing. That is to say, godliness and God's will is constantly surrounding us. But it takes a special person to tune into it, like a radio tower, to get the right frequency, to understand, and given the static of our own mind, to separate the static from the actual godliness that is around us, that needs to be then reflected in words to the rest of the community. What most prophets do, and Rambam explains this best, but I'll try and do him justice and paraphrase. What most prophets do is tune into a radio station, K God. A lot of radio stations in America have a K before the call signs. And they get some static and they get a lot of God, as opposed to the rest of us, which mostly just hear the static of our own mind. And they have to take what they can hear and a little bit of the mixture of their own imagery of, okay, I'm hearing this I get a feel for God's greatness, and that makes me think of a king. And so I'm going to portray God, when I try to put this into words, as on a throne. And that's them putting a linguistic overlay, a mental visualization onto what they have experienced from their encounter with God.
I can totally get that. And for me, that's how I read the Torah as well, because the language seems to change so often in the Torah. I totally believe that God speaks to people in a language that they understand. So when we've got Abraham and he sits by these amazing
Mhm.
cedar trees, and then you find out that cedar trees are where people went to meet wise people to get answers to their questions. And I'm thinking, well, of course Abraham's going to go and sit by these trees to try and understand. That was culturally what people did.
Right.
And so I really do believe that there are changes, cultural changes, and linguistic changes, and social changes within different groups of people, and they are going to radically change what a prophet does and doesn't say, because the people won't understand. The people,
Mhm.
in Ezekiel's time, they wouldn't understand what it was like to be in Abraham's footsteps. It was a very different period of time. So yeah,
Right.
you carry on. I just wanted to throw that in.
No, no, it's a very good explanation, but it also does highlight one of the differences. So, according to Jewish tradition, and really when you read through the Torah itself with this in mind, it becomes even clearer. The experience of Moses seems radically different from most of the other prophets, really, according to tradition, from all the other prophets. Moses doesn't describe God as sitting on a throne. Moses doesn't describe God in the heavy anthropomorphic sense. Moses never talks about seeing angels with four faces and wheels within wheels. He doesn't see the earth as God's footstool and all the beautiful but very metaphorical imagery of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the other prophets. He just says, God wants us to keep Shabbat. God wants us to not murder each other. God wants us to be honest in our business dealings. And it's like, what? This is prophecy? No, prophecy is poetry. No. Lesser prophets, and it sounds really uncomfortable to call Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the others lesser prophets, but compared to Moses, they are. Lesser prophets are left with poetry because they can't encapsulate God in prose, because their own mind keeps getting in the way, their own limitation keeps getting in the way. Moses didn't have that limitation. One of the most famous things that's said about Moses is that he was the most humble of all people. That's not just talking about his modesty in the sense that he went, oh, shucks, it was nothing. It's talking about he put none of himself into his transmission of what God was showing him. He did not mediate that experience. He was able to take that crystal clear understanding, no static of what God was and what God wanted, and put it into simple prose that could be understood by the people around him. And it was only because of that directness, that simpleness, that clarity, that what Moses experienced became prophecy for all time. That is to say, for not just his generation, and not just his family, but for all generations. Again, I recommend people to look in Rambam in the Guide for the Perplexed. He explains this in much greater detail, the supremacy of Mosaic prophecy and the idea that other prophets spoke as best they could, both those who came before Moses and after, to either their own family or their own generation, but they had inherent limits that prevented them from being the equal of Moses, and therefore could not give commandments that were for all time.
Isn't there though also that's the kind of the thing that Moses, when he communicated with God, did it while he was conscious and awake, and we get the impression that other prophets received their revelation through trance or sleep or any number of other things.
A vision, exactly. That in some way, shape, or form, what they were experiencing was being mediated by the imaginary faculty. And imaginary, again, doesn't mean wrong. I know we have an unfortunate holdover from the rationalist spike that treats imagination as though it's a dirty word. But it is part of the human condition the only way they could make sense of what they were experiencing from God was with images and metaphors of things they were familiar with. The difficulty, of course, is always that trying to get God into our experience means leaping a huge gap of understanding, because God is like nothing that we experience in this world directly. So the best most of us can do is hope to read the revelation from people greater than us and then hold on to their coattails. But the best other prophets could do was take that experience and wrap it in the images and the things of this world that were most similar in their minds to what they had experienced. And that's how we end up with the poetry of the prophets, thank God. But Moses was different. Moses didn't need to wrap it up in poetry. Moses was able to wrap it in action, to say, I have seen this essence of God, and the closest way I can understand this essence of God is if we do this. If we are honest in our business dealings, if we are using fair weights and measures, if we are living in a sukkah on this holiday, if we are keeping Shabbat, if we are building this kind of structure, that is the best way we can physically capture this experience of God through our action, rather than just through metaphor and poetry. And that's what makes the Torah so unique throughout the entire Bible.
It's interesting actually thinking about it that so Moses had this very personal understanding of God and relationship with God and the way he delivered the information to the people, and then you've got this whole line of prophets who had very visionary, as you said, poetic understanding that was normally based around their social structure in the way that they explained it. But then also, on the flip side, the people who were around at the time of the prophets received God's judgment in a very social way as well, whereas the people of Moses' time got a much more, real life example of God's power.
So this whole idea of Torah, that it is the physical encapsulation, the expression of both the ideas and the commandedness that comes from an encounter, a clear encounter with God, is based upon something or expressed in something that is said in rabbinic literature, which is that the Torah was written before the world was made, and that God looked into the Torah and then created the world from it, which sounds really bizarre when you first encounter this midrash, this teaching by the sages. But if you stop for a second and think about it, which is always good advice, now that I think about it, it had to be this way, right? The Torah, as an expression of what God wants from this world and what is expected of us in this world, could only exist if the world itself was made to fit those expectations. Right? God expects nothing of us that we cannot do. God expects nothing of us that this world cannot provide. Therefore, this world had to be made to measure in order to live up to that expectation, in order to fulfill that expectation. And given that the creator of both Torah as well as the world is one and the same, it would be odd if the person who made the world made a faulty instruction book that didn't take into account the reality of the world.
But that would suppose that there's no... Are you talking about the Torah as in the lists of commandments and do's and don'ts, or the Torah as the 5 books? Because if you're talking about the Torah as the 5 books, that would totally dispel any free will.
Okay. So then we have to get into the notion of, well, wait a minute. Is the Torah, was it an actual document that existed that God was looking in when he was creating the world? And if so, as you point out, then at least through the time of Moses, the first couple thousand years of after creation, where's free will? We can already look to chapter 5 and see what's going to happen. And that's going to introduce another idea that is perhaps controversial. We'll see. It's an idea that Abraham Joshua Heschel put forward, a great rabbi from the early or from the 20th century, Um, and he tried to explain it like this. He said the entire Torah is essentially midrash. That is to say, all of the Torah is an explanation, an interpretation, an attempt to make God real. And indeed, the essence of Torah, the true shimmering truth of Torah, that's God. And that, of course, predates the world. And that, of course, guided the creation of the world. The Torah that we have was indeed the product of Moses intersecting with God and then creating this text out of that experience in its like I said, its greatest form of clarity from that encounter with God. So yes, the hyper literal reading of that midrash that God looked in the Torah and wrote the world, that's not what was trying to be taught by that midrash. What the midrash wasn't trying to teach us that God wrote out everything that happened to Abraham and then sat back and watched it all happen. What the midrash is trying to teach us is that the world and the Torah fit together perfectly, and that the world was created so that the Torah, so that our role, our expression, our connection to God through it could exist. That is really the point of trying to explain it this way. Because there's a lot of people who think of the Torah as being just sort of slapped on top of the world. It's like sort of there's God made the world, God made people, then he went, maybe I should give them some instructions. And I'll tell them to do a few things like this and that and the other. And it can seem almost like a random, sticker stuck over the top of life. And what the Midrash is saying is like, no, the world was made so that we could live like this, so that Torah, as we know it both physically, and Torah as the grander idea of God expressed in this world through our action and understanding, could exist.
You could sell a lot of headache pills. I kind of wondered that. I wonder if rather than the Torah as a physical or even a list of text, maybe that's not what it is. Maybe it's more about the rules of physics. Maybe it's the makeup of the world that we have, science and the understanding of everything. Maybe that is the tool that you can break down into the one half being how we can live, and on the other half how before the creation happened there was a list of what can and can't happen. To be honest, it's giving me a headache.
Good. It's like when you go to the gym and you have sore muscles afterwards. It means you did something right. It means you were moving muscles in a way that was making them stretch. And if you got a headache, then you're thinking hard, and that's good. Never be afraid of a headache from thinking. But where you're going with that, yes, it's perfectly fine. The entirety of reality, the whole structure of life from the Big Bang to now, from physics and evolution and chemistry and DNA and all of these things, that they fit with Torah. That is to say, the Torah in the limited sense, the physical 5 books, and that our morality that is expressed in them and our actions and spirituality that is expressed in them mesh. Shouldn't come as a surprise, even though it often feels surprising. Because, again, it's the same author. The God who wrote the laws of gravity is the same God who wrote the law of morality. And they blend together on purpose. Again, the whole point of Torah was that it was helping us to live within the physical realm that God had created, whereby we could make our spiritual journey and choices in a way that would allow our essence, our spirit, to grow closer to God. And everything in the world is designed to do that. We mess it up an awful lot by our own choices and our own activities, and we make it harder for ourselves or for each other when we do all sorts of problems. But when we do it right, we shouldn't be surprised that it works.
I feel that we are snipping just the beginning of the Bible off by not going on to talk about the Tanakh. So maybe after we've done the Mishnah and the Gemara. We'll talk about Tanakh and then Midrash and
Yes.
the extensions. But how does this Torah? How are we gonna bridge this and the I think it's the Mishnah we're talking about next week.
Correct.
So
Correct.
how do we bridge those two things? Where do we leave it today?
All right. So what we have to say as a preface before we go on to the Mishnah is that as brilliant as the Torah is, as this concise and clear, and yes, it is concise, and yes, it is clear in its fashion, expression of what God wants from the Jewish people within this world as a concrete instruction. It is incapable of being everything to everyone at all time without additional explanation, instruction, and debate over application in a case-by-case sort of way. It's the same way that the Constitution of the United States or of any other country, if you live in a constitutional country, or at least the body of laws that form the foundation that are inviolate, don't tell the cop on the street what he has to do. Don't tell the individual citizen what he or she has to do. But you need a body of explanation, of application to show you this is the way you handle this, this is the way you handle that, according to this constitutional document, this constituent text that creates the framework in which all of this else happens. And the Torah is that sort of constitutional, foundational, has everything you absolutely need, but the individual application and the individual explanation and the case by case in particular, that you're going to have to train yourself to extract, understand, and apply as you need, as your communities change, as individuals need it, and as history progresses.
It feels
and that
very
will
much.
take us to Mishnah.
You mentioned there the law, and I get this image. So you go to these great courthouses now, like Supreme Court Justice, and they've got these huge libraries of all of the cases that have been tried. And often an interesting new case will come up, and they will go and look at the closest previous example they have to that.
Right, precedent.
A precedent, right. And I get the impression that the Mishnah is a list of previous precedents that help unravel the bullet points of Torah.
It's bullet points is a great term, yes. It is I would go one step further and say the Mishnah is a distillation of the precedent of how to teach, how to apply Torah. So it's an even further level of refinement, which is why the Mishnah is actually pretty short for what it tries to do, and why the Gemara had to come along later and make sure we understood everything the Mishnah was trying to do. Because it didn't explain itself in 100% detail, because it wasn't intended. The Mishnah was also intended to be a sort of bullet point, but we'll go into that in more detail when we cover the Mishnah together. The Torah, you can turn it and turn it and turn it. The important thing is to remember that it is not just a book. It is not just a document. It is almost like trying to capture the rainbow of the experience of God at that moment, so that we can learn from it forever, so that it can always light our world with its beauty and its color. But that means that it's not always easy to fully grasp. It takes time and effort. And if you just read it as literature, or if you just read it on a surface level because you feel you're being true to some literalness of it, then you are missing its depths and you're missing its purpose. And quite frankly, and I hope no one gets offended, you're missing God.
Okay. Now, well, if they're getting offended, then they should go somewhere else for their videos. All right, well, I think we're done. If you guys have questions at home about what we've covered, please feel free to leave them in the comments section under this video, and we will maybe address them in a separate video after we've got these first 3 done. So this one is 2 more, then maybe we'll do questions on these 3 videos, and then maybe we'll go on to do Midrash and Tanakh and some other things. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for giving us your time. I very much appreciate it. It's a complete pleasure being able to do these programs.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
And we'll see you guys in the next one. If you want to hear more from Rabbi Neely, you can find links to his channel under this video as well, and another one for a playlist of everything he's done with me on this channel underneath that. And we'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.